Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Life of a Business Manager podcast. This is the podcast where we break down the real world skills every business manager needs to succeed. I'm your host, Sina Chan. And on today's episode, we have part two with my guest, Ramana Sastry. We're going to discuss the medical equipment management plan, cybersecurity, and some of the challenges associated with working in a clinical technologies department. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Let's dive right in. Hi, Ramana. Welcome back to the podcast.
Hi, Sina. How are you?
Good, good. This is part 2,
Yep.
meaning we're going to dive right in.
Yep. And thanks for having me back. I appreciate it.
Of course, anytime. So today we're doing part 2, which is understanding the role of clinical technology and when it comes to managing medical equipment management plan. And
Right.
also we're going to go over the current challenges, right?
Sure.
Okay.
So we can start off with the medical equipment management plan. That's what's mandated by CMS and Joint Commission because we fall clinical technologies or medical equipment management falls under the EOC chapter, and there are specific requirements, and they do require each of the EOC chapters to have a management plan, and the medical equipment management plan is core to what we do. It is one of the documents that Joint Commission, the CMS, the State Department of Public Health, any organization that comes in starts off with a review of our document review of our medical equipment management plan. So that's what it spells out exactly what we do, how we do it, and if there are any exclusions to our medical device inventory, or if there are any other inclusions in the medical device inventory that it's not a standard device. And based on that, we then develop our policies and procedures on how we do it.
So then can you give an example of, say, the place you used to work at in regards to the medical equipment management plan where something was, you said, exclusive?
Excluded, yes. So, for example, where I worked last time, clinical technologies was not responsible, say, for sterilizers. That was facilities. So, but sterilizers technically falls under the medical equipment management plan or under the EOC chapter of medical equipment management. And so therefore we had to call that out separately in our medical equipment management plan or MEMP. Also excluded in the MEMP was the stretchers and beds, which are considered medical devices, but that facilities took care of that, so we called those out as well. What we did include were certain devices that were not technically medical devices, but sort of data aggregators. They take data from a variety of different medical devices, aggregate it so that it could be moved over to the EMR. And technically, those are not medical devices as per the FDA's definition, but they play a very important role in the use of a medical device. So therefore, we did include that in our medical equipment management plan. And since it's not traditionally it's not defined as a medical device, we call that out in our MEP saying that we do these devices as well.
So every organization has this plan, Ramana?
Yes, every organization that is surveyed by the Joint Commission.
Okay. And can you share some of the components of it? Like, for example, the biomedical engineering, the systems engineering, the
Right.
device
So
security, all of that. Can you share, just give the audience a little bit as far as what does the plan consist of? What are the categories and which ones do you think that AI might affect, or would it be all of the components? I'm
I
just
think
curious.
AI potentially can affect a lot of these components. But let's start off with the core of our medical equipment management plan. It starts off with biomedical engineering. One of the requirements that both CMS, Joint Commission, and our Department of Public Health requires is that we maintain a risk-based medical device inventory. Each individual hospital can select their own categorization plan. And once we accept that risk categorization plan, any device that comes in has to be categorized or classified, and then there has to be a risk associated with it. And then we aggregate these risk numbers into distinct risk categories. For example, risk one is our life support systems, and there by life support systems or risk ones, we designate that in our MEMP that we have to have 100% PM completion on these devices. That means that we have to have 100% inventory accuracy as well. You need to know where all of your risk one devices are at any given time. You cannot have a UTL or unable to locate during a PM of a risk one device. Risk two devices are your general biomedical devices. Their Commission came up a number of years ago saying that we needed to have 100% 100% completion of the hospital activities centered around medical devices. And we took that definition to mean 100% of the work orders associated with risk two devices have to be completed. Risk two devices do not mean we don't necessarily, most of them are, I should say, a large number of them are mobile, and it's always going to be difficult to find them during the month that they're due. So, what we have set up is a UTL system or unable to locate system. That's why, but if the work orders are closed with a UTL or unable to locate, then that satisfies that 100% completion of hospital activities for risk two devices. Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes sense. And how many times does this plan actually get reviewed or revised, or does it actually get revised, or it just depends on the state of the organization?
No, Joint Commission requires it to be reviewed and republish it again annually.
Annually.
So
Okay.
yeah, so we did it at the beginning of the fiscal year. And, so every year, each chapter of the EOC would submit their medical equipment with their management plans for the to be implemented at the beginning of the fiscal year. So it's annual.
So for the amount of years that you've worked at the previous organizations, have you seen an increase in the amount of changes on this plan, or is it been pretty flat, like as far as their changes?
The core plan stays relatively the same because the plan designates how we inspect devices when they come in, what we call incoming inspections. We designate what's going to be permanent assets or temporary assets, and those. There's not much change to that. What has changed in the last several years, for example, 5, 6 years ago, we added a medical device cybersecurity section to the MEP, and we also added water. We don't do clinical technologies, does not do the water testing itself for dialysis, but we are required to actually um, double check to make sure that the water samples are being sent out to a qualified lab and the results are coming back in and the results are within certain parameters so that those dialysis units can be continued to use. So that gets updated on a regular basis depending upon who does the work for the quality testing. So there are certain sections of the medical equipment plan that gets updated on a regular basis, but the bulk of it stays the same.
Can you elaborate a little bit more on the cybersecurity component, because I know that was a big deal when it came up when we were like requesting equipment and all of that. So, can you just give the audience a little bit of an example of the cybersecurity and what you've had to deal with, and especially now where it's so easy to kind of get into an organization's sensitive information and all of that.
So cybersecurity, basically the way we looked at it is we incorporated cybersecurity in the same way we incorporated our other functions, such as say our primary responsibility for medical devices and medical device management is to ensure safety and accuracy of the data. And we extrapolated that to cybersecurity as safety with regard to cybersecurity is availability of the device. So we have to make sure that the devices, regardless of what the issues are, or if there is if there are some the IT does a regular check on the network. We have to make sure that these devices stay active and that these intrusive checks by IT does not disable a device. So that's considered availability is our primary focus for safety with regard to cybersecurity. Now, with the other components of it, these devices also, we have to also check on a regular basis the integrity of the data that's being exported out of the medical device and the integrity of the data that's going into the medical device. Data examples of data going into the medical device would be your Active Directory, so that you can select patients, etc. We need to make sure it's going to the right machine at the right time, so that they can actually, um, you know, consistent data coming in, and the right patient is selected. Data going out of the medical device would be data points that are going into directly to the EMR. And there's a lot of work associated with that. And again, it's a multidisciplinary team. ClinTech is ultimately responsible for that. However, getting the data from a machine to to the EMR, there's a lot of work from both nursing and physician informaticists, IT, and a variety of different IT groups. So that's another component, is to ensure that the data points that are going into the EMR are going into the right field and they're accurate. So there we do have a section when the clinicians actually have to, in some cases, have to validate the data before they hit send going to the EMR. And we work with the clinicians to help develop those policies and procedures on a day-to-day basis.
And I noticed you had mentioned that you work with not just clinicians, but like IT and facilities a lot, right? Can
Correct.
you explain to us why that collaboration is critical for like patient care, patient safety, and for the operational efficiency?
Yeah, well, medical devices have evolved. Today, majority of medical devices are no longer standalone devices. They're all sit on the network. And therefore, when the medical device, to ensure the safety of the use of the medical device, we have to make sure that the network that it sits on is able to recognize that as a medical device. That's number one. And number two, to make sure that the data going from point A to point B is accurate and there is no intrusion from external sources into that data stream. So one of the things for regarding the cybersecurity is that we want to ensure that a medical device is not the vector in which we get an intrusion into our network or a virus into our network. And therefore, there's a lot of things that set around it. And also, IT has set up really stringent rules on what's acceptable to go onto the network and what is not. And therefore, that's where we get to that point where we have to check medical devices to make sure that they meet those IT standards. And we've extrapolated those IT standards and set up a set of standards for medical devices that sit on the network. So therefore, we want to ensure that that devices that are getting onto the network meet the minimum IT security standards. Case in point, sometimes in large institutions, people can buy equipment, but if it sits on the network and it did not go through the proper cybersecurity assessment, then we cannot put it into service. And sometimes, I mean, that has happened in numerous times. And when it does happen, we get pushback from the clinician saying that it's urgent to put this into service because there is a patient that's waiting for a therapy or a procedure that this device is needed for. However, imperative that is, we cannot put it onto the network unless we can guarantee that it's safe to go onto that network. A good case in point was one vendor sold us, or sold this group of clinicians, a device that had a very, very old operating system that was no longer being patched. And IT had said that those systems, any device with that operating system, cannot be on the network. So we tend to be the police of that as well. And that sometimes that's a difficult place to be, because on one hand, we're trying to get to support the clinicians in delivery of patient care. On the other hand, we're trying to make sure that our institution is safe from attack, from cyber attacks.
Yes, I agree with you, Ramana. I think one of the hurdles I had as a business manager for purchasing all those equipment was the fact that they needed the equipment like yesterday, right?
Right.
So, I think we were able to identify the gap to add clinical technologies to pretty much like stamp approval, right, for the
Mhm.
equipment prior to it getting shipped. But I think in a big organization, it's so hard to manage when you have all of the clinicians involved and patient involved, and you're just trying to support the patients, but you don't have the equipment. So I think that is one, I wouldn't say challenge, but one issue when it comes to such a big organization is just tracking all the equipment. Like everyone
Right.
is purchasing their own type of equipment. And so I don't know from a clinical technology perspective how, I mean, I could see how difficult it is to manage all of those equipment. I think that's one of the issue.
Right. So the sooner you get, I think the sooner an institution gets their clinical technologies involved in the evaluation of the product or the purchase of the product, we can definitely make it work. There are things, for example, if something does not, if a clinician really needs a device that does not meet the minimum IT security standards, there are ways we can protect that device on the network. We can isolate that device on the network. But again, we can do that if we have sufficient time to be aware. For example, if there's a device that a clinician absolutely needs, and we know for a fact that it does not meet the minimum IT security standards, there are ways to segregate that one device or that group of devices on the network so that it can be protected. And IT would accept that assessment and that segregation as a check mark for meeting their security standards. So there are ways to go around it, but it only works when we have sufficient time, when we're informed about it, not when we're informed about it when it arrives at the dock and the clinicians are expecting, Clintech or Biomed to do a quick electrical safety and performance verification and put it into service. When it has not been done for cybersecurity, then that creates delays. So if you want to avoid delay, cybersecurity, the reality is cybersecurity is here. Institutions are being bombarded with attacks. I mean, thousands on a daily basis, thousand attacks on a daily basis. In order to keep that, creating a problem, we just need to be aware of what's happening and, if necessary, segregate a device on the network so that the clinicians can, in fact, use that device, even though it does not meet the security standards.
Do you feel like that was challenging though to manage from at least from the organization you worked at, Ramana? Because I remember going through quite a few different equipments, and I think the only person that was like kind of the middle person was me, right? From the operators to clinical
Right.
technologies.
Right. So I think in the last place I worked at, they created, I think the idea was to get us informed. Yeah, it is very challenging, especially if we are brought into it at the very end. And it's very challenging to meet the needs of the clinicians and meet the needs of the cybersecurity needs of IT. So one of the things that we've implemented as an enterprise wide was an intake tool where anybody who wants to bring any system on board has to put that into that intake tool, and then it gets parsed out because it isn't only clinical technologies that has to review it and work on it. Because what we noticed was, for example, you have infection prevention that gets involved as well, because buy equipment and they don't necessarily read the instructions for use. It isn't just clinical technologies on the cybersecurity portion of it or the network access. There's also other groups that have to review a medical device before it comes in and being used in a hospital. And having a system where an intake tool where all these groups can parse it out is very, very useful. I think we saw in the last couple of years that was very, very helpful getting ahead of it by looking at some things that people are asking for, and while they were still asking for it, while they were still looking for funding of it, we were able to mitigate some of the delays by doing the homework beforehand.
So then what criteria do you believe are most important when deciding whether to invest in new medical technologies or upgrading an existing one? Like from your experience, you've seen all the different types of equipment that's, come through the organization. What would you look for?
Serviceability was the first one. In other words, whether the device can or the system can be maintained. We need to make sure if an existing system has reached its end of life, manufacturers may say that, hey, we are not able to support this either through tech support, through parts, or even field service. Then there's nothing we can do. It's basically run to fail. When that device fails, we can't do anything about it if we do not have the manufacturer's support for maintenance. The other portion of it is service histories, because something could be still well within its service life. But if we notice that the device or a system has an excessive, work or service calls or failures, then that's another thing that you need to look at. So I would do it by service histories and whether it's end of life or end of support would be the two primary key things that have to do it. Also, now what's been introduced lately with the cybersecurity is we have to look at if that operating system is still supported by the manufacturer, because the operating system does not necessarily be handled by the OEM or the original equipment manufacturer. It could be Microsoft, it could be another company that has an operating system embedded in the medical device. Those we have to make sure that those operating systems are up to date and current. And that was one of the challenges that was introduced in the last 5 years, is that the life cycle of the operating system was a lot faster than the life cycle of the medical device itself. Medical devices can go 7 to 10 years, for example, according to the AMA guidelines, but operating systems can go end of life after a few years, maybe a couple of years. And so therefore we were trying to figure out how best to address that. And one of the things that we were working on recently was network segregation. One of the ways to protect devices from antiquated or non-supported operating system was to segregate these devices onto the network so that nothing else, only specific inputs can get to that device. And no one that can access that device from any other location. One simple way is simply you get on the network and you can ping a device. If you can see a device from your laptop, then that's not secure. You need to be able to secure it by making sure that no one can see that device on the network.
So I think from a customer's perspective, like any business managers listening out there, or anyone that is in charge of purchasing capital equipment, I think one of the challenges we had, Ramana, was our operators would always want like the newest technology, right? Because
Mhm.
as an organization, we're competing with other organizations that have the newer technology where all the patients are going to. And so we're trying to keep up with technology, but also have the equipment available for the clinicians to use. So I think it's kind of a, I wouldn't even say a happy medium, but like meet in the middle somewhere. It was challenging to figure out exactly, do we replace this? Do we get new technology? What exactly do we do? And I think when you have so many people involved also it gets difficult to make a solid decision.
Right. And I think conversations like what we used to have works really well. Meet on a regular basis and not just meet during the beginning of a capital cycle or when a clinician needs something, but to constantly look at the inventory, look at these are the things that we're seeing. These are the things that the clinicians are asking for. These are the things that maintenance is getting to be very expensive on these devices. We meet on a regular basis. I mean, almost weekly or monthly at least, to make sure that nothing falls through the cracks, and then we know the customer's needs or the clinician's needs well beforehand before it becomes an emergency. I think by having those meetings with all of our customer groups, that really helped us get past the time crunch at capital cycle time.
And you don't need to answer this, Ramna, but were we the most difficult customers?
No, 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 you weren't. Any clinical group that uses medical devices, it's always challenging. I mean, the challenges that you and I saw with that group was the same challenges that we saw with all the other groups, and that's why in the last couple of years we started to have those type of meetings with a lot of other groups, including a variety of different nursing groups as well. Regular conversations on what is needed, what is available, and what we can and cannot do really helps streamline the process of getting medical equipment on site.
Yes, I think from the customer perspective, the fleet process of equipment, I think really helped us, Ramana, when it came to capital funding, because I
Right,
obviously didn't have enough funding to cover all of the equipment. So that
right.
fleet process, I think, really helped close the gap for us in order to still continue supporting the patients and all of that.
Right. And the fleet process started because I was noticing people when they had capital dollars to spend, they weren't necessarily thinking about, and rightfully so, the clinicians are thinking about what they want to do for their patients or to bring in larger volumes of patients by what technology can do. And they were focusing on that and not focusing on retiring and replacing existing technologies. And over time, as an institution, we dug ourselves into a very big hole and trying to get out of that. That's why we took on the responsibility for anything that's designated as fleet equipment. The Cleantech would be responsible for replacing it on a regular basis when it's needed. What's considered to be fleet, for example, infusion pumps are fleet, physiological monitors are fleet, anesthesia machines are fleet, dialysis machines are fleet. Portable CTs and portable X-rays are fleet, but stationary CTs and MRs are not fleet, and those would have to go through a separate capital process through, the process of where you have to get the buy-in and selective process of presenting to the capital committee and let them and go through a voting process to see, what the competing equipment or competing requests are. But fleet, if it's an existing system, that it should not go through a competitive process. When it needs to be replaced, we need to be able to replace it. And that was a major breakthrough for us, is that being able to get those fleet dollars allocated to us on an annual basis, we can then project multiple years out when we're going to replace things based upon what we're expecting to get in fleet dollars every year.
Yes, I agree. The fleet process helped streamline at least how and when we were looking to replace equipment. And it just helped us focus on like new technology. or
Mhm.
any type of technology that the surgeons want to bring in. So I think it
Right.
made the process a lot more smoothly. Let's pivot. Let's go to the current challenges, Ramana. Can you go over some of the challenges, like how to handle clinical applications that either fall under the FDA?
Right. So if it falls under the FDA, if it falls definition of a medical device, regardless if it's a software application or it's a discrete device, it should be clinical technology. But there are devices that are out there, as I alluded to earlier, that there are devices that necessarily not technically a medical device, but they're more like data aggregators. But if that data aggregator fails, and that could have a severe impact on the use of that medical device. A lot of these data aggregators will not only aggregate data coming from the medical device, but they also aggregate data going into the medical device. And sometimes if that aggregator fails, if that intermediary device fails, it could impact the use of that device, meaning that you might not be able to use that device. That's something where even though it's not considered to be a medical device, we would take it on as a medical device because its failure would impact the medical device directly. So I think on the large scale, it's a philosophical question. Right now at the last place we were joined at the hip with clinical applications, but that joining of the hip sometimes creates delays for resolving issues. And one of the things that I guess one of my people had mentioned is that consider, and we hadn't had a chance to do that before I retired, but consider taking clinical applications becoming part of the clinical technologies family, like cybersecurity, biomedical engineering, systems engineering, etc. But it is always a challenge because, and the challenge was exasperated during the pandemic when the cleantech biomedtechs were on site, but a lot of the other ancillary technical groups were not. And it fell on us. And then after that, we just took it on. But then how do we parse it back up? Because during the pandemic, we took certain responsibilities on, but it also has to do with distribution of labor and allocation of labor to those groups. So it is a challenge between the gray area between clinical apps and cleantech. It's one solution that was presented just before I left was to consider whether clinical applications should fall under clinical technologies, specifically under the systems engineering team.
Can you give an example of the clinical applications for the audience that's listening?
Yeah, I forgot the name is escaping me, but there was a system up in our EP cath labs that took information from our hemodynamic monitoring systems, and they weren't integrated into Epic, so they had their own EMR type of thing locally within the EP cath lab, and that fell under the clinical applications group. And it's not a physical device; it resides on the system. That application resides on the network, but when that system has a glitch or a failure, it really curtails the use of the medical device. You can't use the medical device anymore. And that's one example. I think Cardo was one of them. I think you worked on Cardo as well to get from the EP Cath labs. And with that was a gray area between clinical technologies and IT and clinical apps specifically.
And if it's a gray area, was it decided before you left or no?
No, that was still under negotiations. But one of the things that we just, even if it's a gray area, it may be gray area for a considerable amount of time. But from a end user, from a customer or clinician's perspective, if there's a problem, it's hard for the clinician to determine who to go to. Do I go to clinical technologies? Do I go to network people? Do I go to clinical apps? So what we decided was is that all the calls come to us and we'll parse it out. That way, for the end user, it'll be one-stop shopping.
Yes, that's the gray area again, Ramana, where the customers get confused. Hey there, fellow business managers. Are you looking to save time and boost productivity in your role? Let me introduce you to my stand store, where I've put together a collection of ready to use business templates designed specifically for people like us. These templates are practical, professional, and crafted with the day to day challenges of business management in mind. Check out my stand store now at standstore/life of a business manager. Thank you so much for supporting the podcast and hope you enjoy the rest of the episode. We don't know
Right.
who to go to when it comes to clinical technologies. Well, from your opinion, no, for the clinical applications, do you think that should fall under clinical technologies? I'm just curious.
Yeah, yeah, I say yeah. That's an interesting. That's a loaded question, but yeah, personally, I would say yes because it still impacts the technologies used in the delivery of patient care, and that by definition is clinical technologies. So, and it doesn't mean you need to. It's a combination of so clinical technologies. It's not just clinical engineers or biomedical engineers or biomedical technicians moving forward, it's going to include a variety of different IT professionals as well. So yes, in the answer to your question, I would say yes, it should fall under clinical technologies because it is a technology that is used directly in the in delivery of patient healthcare.
Understood. I agree. Although I was sending everything to clinical technology as a
Anyway,
customer. Can you talk a little bit? I think we got into this in part one, but I don't know if we did. The benchmark where you talk about the cost of ownership of the technology throughout its useful life. Remember, we had worked on
right.
that when you were with the organization.
So yeah, that's a very that's walking into a minefield depending upon who's listening because there's a lot of different opinions on that. The general standard by the College of Clinical Engineers is what we call the cost to value ratio, where the numerator of that ratio is the total program cost for clinical technologies divided by the total acquisition cost of the technologies that we maintain. That is a much better way because the older ways that people do it is the number of benchmark labor, for example, the number of devices per technician. But that doesn't necessarily work anymore. That's a very antiquated way to do it, especially it goes back to the early 1970s. But for example, a device could have an anesthesia machine PM takes anywhere between 4 to 8 hours, depending upon the experience of the technician or the engineer doing it. Dialysis machine PMs take about 4 to 5 hours sometimes. However, a PM on a physiological monitor, it could be 5 to 10 minutes. So when you do the number of devices per technician, then without it being properly weighted, then it becomes challenging to come up with the right benchmark for labor. That's one of the challenges. I would prefer really the cost to value ratio. It's not perfect, and I think no benchmark is going to be perfect, but it does take into account the value. And there are benchmarks, for example, for acute care hospitals, the cost to value ratio should be around maybe 4 or 5. And then for large healthcare or university medical centers or healthcare systems, it should be between 7 and 9, depending upon the complexities and also the jurisdiction of that particular department. So, yes, I think cost to value ratio also gives you a better idea of the cost of using that device over its lifespan. And we track cost to value on an annual basis based upon now as our costs go up, or if the number of devices go up as well, or the cost of the devices go up. So I think that's a better, it's not perfect, but it's a better way than number of devices, a simple number of devices per technician or engineer. But then that doesn't take into account the resources you need for cybersecurity. That does not take into account the resources you need for device integration, i.e., integrating the medical device into the IT networks and as well as to the EMR. So it does not really. That's why I say it's antiquated because you really need to look at it from the perspective of today's. What does clinical technologies do today? Because the benchmark that people are using still is the number of devices per technician does not take into account all of that. Also, it does not take into account the business aspect of it. We have, built into our clinical technologies, we have, contract management, and it does not take into the number of technicians per 100 devices or whatever it may be. Does not take into account all those ancillary functions that are vital and crucial to the day-to-day operations of a clinical technologies department.
Can you give the audience a little bit of let's just pick an equipment, like for example, anesthesia machines, right?
Mhm.
They are roughly, depending on who you purchase from, I think they're between, is it 90 to $100,000 roughly for one, I want to say.
Lynn, I think so. When an anesthesia machine comes, yes, it is about. I would say about closer to 75 to 80.
Okay.
But that's not just the machine itself. You also have to take into account once the machine comes in, we have to add a lot of other ancillary systems to it. The physiological monitor. We have to add the computer for device integration into integrating it to Epic. We have to add several other, they have the pulse oximetry or cerebral oximetry devices, monitors that we have to add to the anesthesia machine. These are all different devices that have to be added on. So that balloons the price out to maybe anywhere between 85 to 100,000 per machine.
Yes, that's what I was thinking. I was thinking
Right.
of all of those components. But let's just give an example here because I'm thinking out loud from the cost ownership question is say an anesthesia machine, right? How
Mhm.
many biomed technicians do you think needs to manage just one machine? If we're just giving a simple example here.
It's not just I don't know if that's a good trying to figure out.
Or maybe that's not the right question. Maybe it's more on how many labor hours or what are you thinking?
I'm thinking that how many different groups need to be involved in maintaining an anesthesia machine, because
Okay.
anesthesia machines are on the network also. So cybersecurity has to be involved. Also, there is physical maintenance of the devices. So, the anesthesia machine it's not a just purely electronic system. There are mechanical aspects of it that have to be maintained on a regular basis. There's also device integration because the information coming from all the ancillary devices and the anesthesia machines go into our EMR. So all of that. So it's not just how many people, but how many different functions have to be associated with maintaining the anesthesia machine. So that's why I was thinking about clinical technology is no longer a simple biomed break fix shop anymore, but it's a maintenance program that incorporates integration, cybersecurity, the integrity of the actual physical maintenance of the device, and also uh, the ability to to when you maintain an anesthesia machine, for example, the physical maintenance of it, and once you set up the criteria, it basically, an anesthesia machine can go well beyond the useful life that's recommended by the AMA. For example, we used to have a lab at one of our campuses, and we had a test anesthesia machine. Whenever an anesthesiologist say wanted to do something, hey, I want to do this, or I want to add this device to it, it isn't just simply you add the device to the anesthesia machine. It has to be looked at both from a functional approach, but also from an ergonomic approach and a usability approach. That's why we would set it up in the lab, and all the anesthesiologists would come in and go through the lab and tell us, yeah, this monitor, yeah, this works, or no, this doesn't work because I have to raise my head to the right when I should be looking at the patient. So those are all those components that have to be added onto the for maintaining, and not only maintaining it, but evolving the anesthesia machine to current practices.
So then the benchmark part of it would be very challenging to kind of to calculate
Yes,
then because there's too many components, there's too many functions, too many team members here that we're having to kind of get involved just for like example anesthesia machines.
right. And that multiplies as the complexity of the device gets higher. For example, when we maintain our MRIs, that's a whole different thing to be dealt with because there are so many different components of that. And not only different groups within clinical technologies, but different groups within the hospital have to be involved in maintaining the MR as well. It's really challenging when someone's asking, I just need a simple, how many people do you need? Well, give me a basic ratio that you said number of devices per technician. And once you hit that, we'll give you the people. But it's more than that because you have to also maintain, the cybersecurity portion of it, the integration portion of it. And that's one of the challenges that I faced is that some of those groups were understaffed because as that facility grew and expanded, they were looking at it purely from the perspective of the number of technicians or engineers that have to maintain the device, but not the number of people that have to do all the ancillary work to make sure that the device is properly operating on the network.
So we're just going to go a little bit off topic, but I'm
Mhm.
curious. I think the audience might be interested in this, Ramna, because you were the executive director for clinical technology. You're talking about your groups that worked under you, correct? Can
Correct.
you just explain a little bit about the levels, right? There's the biomed one, the two, three, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, but explain how that is classified. And is there like, do you cross train, for example, does a biomed one understand the anesthesia machine as a biomed four? Like, how, and correct me if I'm asking the wrong question, but I'm just curious. I
So
think from a staffing perspective, this might be an interesting topic.
So at our location, we had BMet 1, 2, 3, and 4, those were union positions. So we had to be very, very specific on what the job requirements and what the job duties were based on the job description for each classification. And it was progressive. BMet 1 is entry level with little or no experience, and they would be mentored by twos, threes, and fours. And then, but when you BMet 4, for example, would be essentially, someone who can be put into any area of the hospital and be able to function independently, purely from a day-to-day break fix and maintenance perspective and preventative maintenance. The engineering functions, we had to separate it out because the engineering functions required a different level of education and training. So for the biomeds, we trained them technically for the maintenance of it, but for the engineers, the engineers would handle the same inventory of devices that the technicians did, the biomeds did, but they did it at a systems or at a cybersecurity level. Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes sense. So then, if you were to look back at your staffing, do you think you had the right mix of biomeds and engineering?
In the current world, I would say yes. However, when I see AI, you brought up AI earlier.
Yes.
If a lot of these things, for example, there are certain devices. I'll give you an example: physiological monitors. We still have to do, regular preventative maintenance checks on them on a regular basis based on the manufacturer's service manual. However, a lot of those, yeah, I go into a room and I do a PM check on a physiological monitor, and I can walk out and the device can fail. That preventative maintenance is nothing more, doesn't do anything anymore. That is somewhat of the antiquated things that we're still experiencing. For example, when I was a BMET 2 or 3, when I would work on those physiological monitors back in the day, we would have to actually adjust the gain on certain potentiometers and certain amplifiers to make sure that the output on the screen met up to what the input that we were putting in. However, today you don't do that. It's all modularized, and if something doesn't work, you replace a module these days. So those type of preventative maintenance inspections, though, are still mandatory based upon historical requirements. That could be automated. The machine itself does a lot of diagnostic checks, and those preventative maintenance devices on the physiological monitors can be either the actual physical PMs can be eliminated because the machine is checking these things on a regular basis. All we need to do at that point is if something is going outside of the specifications, then it needs to be integrated with the clinical technologies work order system so they can shoot a work order so it becomes more predictive maintenance as opposed to preventative maintenance. So in that sense, as we move forward in time, then we can see the number of technicians that are needed be overall reduced, but that would be that you have a different level. You may be increasing of the number of engineers because the type of qualifications you need changes over time. So for those kind of systems. But then there are certain devices, like as MRs and CTs, a large component of the preventative maintenance is a physical component. And whereas something that's purely digital, then you can eliminate those PMs and be able to reassign that labor to do other things. Did that answer your question?
Yes, that does. And for all of your biomed techs, did they have to get certifications or recertified like
Yes.
annually or every
No,
couple years?
that's not required. However, for example, to go from say a 2 to a 3 requires the AMI certification, a CBET certification. And then to be a 4, you need to have an active certification. So if you became a and maintaining your certification is not that difficult. You have to attend a couple of meetings, a couple of conferences, read a couple of journals, and then you get the necessary points on an annual basis to keep your certification going. The challenge is passing the first exam to get certified initially. When I took the exam many decades ago, um, it was recommended to me that I work as a technician for 5 to 6 years before I would even attempt taking the exam, because the exam it covers everything, covers from physiological monitors to thermometry to pulse oximetry to dialysis machines to anesthesia machines. So you need to get a broad perspective to pass the exam. And once you do, it's easy to maintain that. It's simply by staying current in the field with your colleagues and peers.
Wow,
But
I didn't know the exam was that extensive, Ramana. Can you give me at a level from level 1 to 5? Is it as difficult as like the bar?
no, It's
Okay.
not as difficult as the bar. What it is I remember there was an individual who came into our department, and that individual was very ambitious, and they wanted to take the certification immediately or within the first year. I did not recommend it to them personally. I said, you really need, if the exams are anything like the way what it was when I took the exam, you need to have a really good background in human anatomy and physiology. And so to take the exam. So, and that individual did not take my advice. They said, what could happen? What's the worst I would do? I don't get certified now. They took the exam and they didn't pass. So they didn't get their certification. Then that individual came to me, and then we prescribed a pathway, classes to take, devices to work on before they would take the exam over again. And I worked with their manager and supervisor to make sure that they would get that. And we also developed an educational program within our department so that the people that have passed the test will mentor and tutor those who do want to take the exam. And it's become more or less standard that they would wait a few years before they take an exam in the field, work in the hospital for a few years before you take the exam.
That's great to know. I think it's just important just because if there's anyone listening that wants to go into this field, if
Mhm.
they want to know like how to get started and work in clinical technology. So we're about to wrap up, Ramana, but I wanted to know if you could talk about kind of your new life now that we're ending part 2. If you want to talk about just, what you're working on, travels and all of that.
Well, I just came back from a major trip. Went to, I mean, two weddings. I mean, three, actually, it was total four weddings this year, and they were all over the place. The first one was in California itself. That was easy peasy because I live in California. The second one was in Massachusetts, my old haunting grounds where I came from. And the third one was in Kigali, Rwanda. And the fourth one was in Hyderabad, India. So we went to all those weddings. And then on the way back, we decided to stop over at Istanbul and just to check out the city. So we spent a week just in Istanbul, just checking out the city. And Istanbul is a beautiful city. It's a fun city to go visit. I really like it, and I like to go back out there again. Right now, I'm looking to um, provide, and again, as a retirement, I'm not looking to get back into the rat race and then to make money. As I think I'm pretty much my financial needs are pretty much met. I'm looking to do something as a consultant where people can approach me, and I created a small LLC. Just got it done, created it this week, and I still have some other work to do to it. Essentially, to consult for programmatic setups or how to approach regulatory compliance in a specific way. And so I don't mind doing consulting work, but I don't want it to be part of a day-to-day grind. I'm not going to be looking for another job per se. I am looking to maybe have a consultancy go where people approach me and ask for advice, and we'll go through my consultancy and we can go through that way. Nothing like getting back into the full mix of the day-to-day grind of working or being employed by somebody. And and
No, congratulations, Ramana, and I think you've worked enough, don't you think?
well, I've been in this field for over 44 years, and last 17 or 18 years with this last location. Yes, I do. My wife has been wanting me to retire for some time now, for the last 3 years, and it's kind of nice because the stress levels are gone, and that's why I don't want to reintroduce the stress levels. But I don't know if this is appropriate to say, but one of the things I realized in the first few months of retirement is that I don't think I like reporting up to anybody.
I think quite a lot of people probably feel that, especially, and it's easy to get caught up into the rat race, right? That everyone talks about. So no one really wants that. I don't even know that's an end goal for everybody, but that's where we start.
Yep, yep, yep. And also, there are other things that are interesting to me outside of clinical engineering, as especially in my retirement, is I am interested in certain energy products that I want to be able to talk about and develop with people. One is basically it's almost like a version of a heat pump that basically converts a waste heat into usable electrical energy. So there's a couple of things that I would like to work on. But again, it's not, I don't want to be part of the rat race. I want to work on it, in based upon my interest and curiosity, and not necessarily based upon the need to make money or the need to develop a startup company with investors and stuff like that. I want to be able to take it simply and be able to do certain things on my own. And those areas are interesting
Oh,
to me, especially in terms of cogeneration of energy, or changing or conversion of energy into more useful forms.
I've taken up enough of your time, Ramana. Thank you for being on this part 2 series, but you could come back and talk about, all of your new initiatives and ideas and consulting and all of that. I will welcome you back anytime.
Sure. Let me get some traction on these projects that I'm working on, and I'll reach out to you.
Okay, perfect, Ramana. Hi, everyone. As a reminder, the content provided in our podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered professional advice. Listeners are encouraged to consult with appropriate professionals before making any business decisions based on the information provided in this podcast. We do not endorse any products or services mentioned unless stated in any of our episodes. Thank you so much for listening.